On the morning of May 21st, 1980, a horrifying discovery shattered the calm in the small town of Ayer, Massachusetts. Inside her own home, 48-year-old Katharina Wrights Brow lay dead, brutally stabbed approximately 30 times and bludgeoned with a blunt object. The viciousness of the attack and the mystery of who could have done it cast a long shadow over the community. It would take nearly 45 years, a winding journey marked by injustice, perseverance, and scientific breakthroughs, before the truth behind Katharina's slaying would finally come to light. Katharina was a hard-working wife and mother of two who lived with her husband in a trailer home on the outskirts of Ayer. Family members described her as a loving mother and a proud grandmother. On that fateful spring morning, Katharina's husband left for work around 7:10 a.m., expecting a day like any other. By 10:45 a.m., Katharina's body was found inside their home, the victim of a savagely violent crime. Investigators determined that Katharina was slain in the narrow window after her husband's departure, likely closer to the earlier end of that time frame. She had suffered 30 stab wounds, 5 of which punctured her heart, and had also been struck repeatedly while still alive, indicating a brutal struggle. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, but the inside of the home told a story of chaos and violence. Furniture was overturned, bloodstains were found throughout, and all evidence pointed towards a fierce fight. One of the weapons, a bloodied kitchen knife, was discovered tossed in a wastebasket. Investigators also noted a possible motive. Katharina's purse was missing, along with a large sum of cash she was known to keep hidden in a linen closet. It appeared that robbery might have been the primary factor in the attack, adding a layer of cold-blooded calculation to the ferocity of the crime. Early on, police focused their attention on a neighbor named Kenny Waters. Kenny lived next door with his girlfriend and worked as a chef at a local diner where Katharina was a frequent customer. In fact, it was common knowledge among some diner staff and locals that Katharina kept significant cash reserves in her home since she didn't trust banks. This rumor put a target on her back, and, in the eyes of investigators, made Kenny a person of interest. He was familiar with the victim's routine and the layout of her home, and he had at least indirect knowledge of her cash stash. Police brought Waters in for questioning shortly after the attack. He had a seemingly solid alibi. He claimed he'd been at work until 8:30 a.m. that morning, then at the local courthouse by 9 a.m. for an unrelated matter. Co-workers and records initially backed up his story, and officers examined his clothing and body on the day of the slaying and found no cuts or blood on him. With no physical evidence tying him to the scene, Waters was released, and the investigation continued without an immediate arrest. This wouldn't be the last time Kenny would be hearing from the cops. For 2 years, Katharina's slaying went unsolved. Then, in October 1982, a dramatic twist changed everything. A man named Robert Osborne, by then the boyfriend of Kenny's ex-girlfriend Brenda, came forward to police. He claimed he had information on the attack and implied that Kenny was the culprit. By many accounts, Osborne was motivated by the reward money associated with the case, though this is simply an allegation, and nothing was ever proven. Brenda Marsh and another former girlfriend, Rosanna Perry, were interrogated for hours about their knowledge of the slaying. Both initially insisted that Kenny was a good guy who wouldn't do anything of the sort. However, investigators leaned on them heavily and implied that the two women may have actually been involved before, during, or after the event. Eventually, under this significant pressure, both women changed their stories and told investigators what they wanted to hear. Brenda said Kenny came home on the morning of May 21st, 1980, with a long scratch on his face. Rosanna claimed Kenny had made remarks about stabbing a woman and stealing her money. These statements were the breakthrough authorities had been waiting for, or so they thought. Fingerprints at the crime scene did not match Waters, but despite this, prosecutors now felt they had enough to charge Kenny. He was arrested in 1982, and after a trial that relied heavily on those shaky witness testimonies, Waters was convicted of Katharina's slaying in May 1983. Kenny Waters vehemently maintained his innocence, and one person above all believed him: his sister, Betty Ann Waters. In an extraordinary act of extreme devotion or pure insanity, Betty Ann, a working mom who hadn't completed high school, decided to go ham. She put herself through college and then law school solely to free her brother. And just to give you some context here, this is 7 years combined of study, all to right this injustice. Over the next 18 years, she doggedly pursued justice, working with the Innocence Project to re-examine the evidence. By the late 1990s, DNA testing technology had advanced dramatically from what was available in 1980. Betty Ann managed to locate crucial evidence from the crime scene that had been preserved: the bloodstains collected from Katharina's home. In 2000, those samples were tested for DNA, and the results were unequivocal. The blood was not Kenny's. Nearly 2 decades after his conviction, Kenny Waters was officially exonerated, and his 1983 conviction was vacated in March 2001. He walked out of prison after spending 18 years locked up for a crime he did not commit. Tragically, though, there was no happily ever after for Kenny. Just 6 months after his release from prison, he died in an accident and never got to see the true resolution to this case. After 2001, the slaying of Katharina Wrights-Brow became a cold case, but it was never forgotten, and a new generation of investigators wanted to right the wrongs of this case. That said, for 20 years, basically nothing happened on the case, until the introduction of a little technology called forensic genealogy. Detectives partnered with forensic specialists from Paraben Nano Labs, a company renowned for genetic genealogy work. By reconstructing family trees and zeroing in on the overlaps, they identified 2 possible suspects, brothers from Massachusetts, both of whom had already died. To differentiate between the two, police located living family members, a relative of each brother, and obtained voluntary DNA samples from them. The result was definitive, and the evidence showed it was an overwhelming statistical match to the older brother, Joseph Leo Boudreau. In June 2025, the district attorney publicly announced that Boudreau had been identified through DNA as the person responsible for Katharina's slaying. Unfortunately, Boudreau would never face trial, as he had died in 2004 at age 61. But after nearly half a century, the case was officially considered solved, based upon the blood found in the household. Boudreau was a longtime Massachusetts resident who was born in 1943. In the 1970s, Boudreau worked in the Framingham area and had a history of violence. He was convicted of armed robbery in 1975. In 1980, he was 37 years old and had no known personal connection to her. Not long after Katharina's slaying, Boudreau moved north to Maine in 1987, where he lived out the rest of his life. Despite extensive queries, investigators have found no link between Boudreau and either Waters or Osborne. Some have speculated that Boudreau may have been a patron of the diner and overheard idle chatter about Katharina's habit of storing money at her house. Others have speculated that Katharina may have simply believed this was what Boudreau came for and revealed the money to him. Under this theory, she was slain afterwards to cover up the robbery. Whatever the case, the full truth will never be known, and certain elements of this case will continue to remain an unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder for you to like this video and to click the share button and send it along to two of your friends or family members. Also, search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to follow me on your chosen platform as well. I'll also toss a link to the podcast in the description to make things even easier. On a chilly evening in March 1974, a quiet Pittsburgh suburb was shaken by a terrible discovery. Police found the lifeless body of 23-year-old Annette Tokars lying in a shallow creek in Hopewell Township. The young woman had been forcefully drowned, a brutal end that sent shockwaves through the community. For Tokars's family, it was the beginning of a nightmare that police now officially claim has been solved. And as you may have guessed from my phrasing, I'm not entirely convinced, but we'll get to that. The tragedy unfolded on March 6, 1974. That night, Annette crossed paths with fate in the most devastating way. She had been out that evening, and according to one acquaintance, she was last seen leaving a local bar with an unidentified man. When she didn't return home, concern grew quickly. The next morning, police officers made a grim discovery in Hopewell Community Park. They found Annette's body face down in a shallow creek within the park grounds. Investigators determined that she had been forcibly held underwater until she drowned. The serene park, normally a spot for picnics and neighborhood gatherings, was now a chilling crime scene cordoned off by yellow tape. Unfortunately, Annette's family learned of her death in the most heartbreaking and impersonal way from a television news report. Her mother was watching the nightly news when the announcer spoke of an unidentified young woman found dead in Hopewell Township. Realizing with horror that it might be her missing daughter, Annette's mother was soon confronted with the unthinkable confirmation. The family's worst fears were realized at the morgue when they identified the Jane Doe as Annette. In the immediate aftermath of the slaying, local law enforcement sprang into action, determined to find whoever was responsible. Detectives interviewed friends, acquaintances, and witnesses who had seen Annette in her final hours. Early on, one name caught their attention: Cornelius McCoy. McCoy was a man who knew Annette and had reportedly seen her on the night of March 5, 1974, just hours before her body was found. He told police that he last saw Annette leaving a bar with another man, which immediately made McCoy both a key witness and a potential suspect. In fact, for a time, investigators focused on McCoy as the prime suspect. Despite their suspicions, police in 1974 struggled to build a case against McCoy or anyone else. The forensic science of the era was primitive by today's standards. Investigators had to rely on old-fashioned detective work, interviews, alibis, and circumstantial clues. McCoy claimed he was innocent, and indeed, he had told police that Annette left with another man, hinting that someone else might be responsible. Detectives followed other leads too. They took note of Annette's on and off boyfriend, a man named Wilkie Sims, who was interviewed at the time. Sims told police he hadn't seen Annette in 2 months and that he had been out of town in West Virginia when she was slain. Notably, it appears that this alibi wasn't meaningfully checked out at the time, which you're going to want to keep in mind for later. With no physical evidence to tie anyone to the crime and conflicting accounts of Annette's last movements, the case hit a wall. The police lacked the proof needed to charge McCoy, Sims, or anyone else, and as the months went by, the trail grew colder. As 1974 turned into 1975 and then into the late 1970s, Annette Tokars' case languished without resolution. The community of Hopewell Township was unnerved that the perpetrator hadn't been brought to justice, but leads were virtually non-existent. Annette's family continued to grieve and wonder, keeping her memory alive even as the investigation stalled and the case officially went cold. The cops continued to believe that Cornelius was likely, though not certainly, responsible, given that he was the last person who had seen her. Cornelius passed away around 2007, taking any secrets he had with him to the grave. With McCoy dead and no new information, it seemed the truth of what happened that night in 1974 might never be known. But Annette's case was never completely forgotten. Her sisters and other loved ones carried the hope that someday they might get answers. They held on to the idea that Annette's life mattered and that someone out there knew what happened. Little did they know, it would take over 5 decades and a new generation of detective work before that hope was apparently realized. The stage was set for what has been claimed to be an extraordinary breakthrough. However, it would require advancements in science and the sheer persistence of a detective who refused to let the case stay cold. In 2017, a seasoned investigator named Patrick Young came across Annette Tokars's case file while working at the Beaver County Detective Bureau. Young, who had been in law enforcement since the mid-1990s, had a passion for cold cases and a knack for uncovering long-buried clues. When he learned about Annette's unsolved slaying, he was intrigued and moved. Here was a 23-year-old woman whose life had been brutally cut short, and for over 40 years no one had answered for the crime. Young made a decision that would change everything. He would dedicate himself to finding out who ended the life of Annette. Chief Detective Young carefully reviewed the old case notes, photographs, and reports. He noted the names of the people involved, including Cornelius McCoy and Walton Sims, and the dead ends that earlier detectives had faced. One thing in the file stood out to him: a leopard print coat that Annette had been wearing on the night of her death. That coat had been collected as evidence back in 1974. Thanks to careful preservation, it remained intact in the police archives. Young wondered if modern forensic technology could reveal something that 1970s science could not. The original investigators had no way to test the coat for DNA, but now, decades later, that was about to change. Detective Young sent Annette's clothing and other preserved evidence for advanced forensic testing. In the lining of that leopard print coat, analysts discovered a stain that yielded a small quantity of DNA. It was a stunning find, and if the authorities' theory is accepted as correct, it's essentially a genetic fingerprint left behind by the perpetrator. Given the nature of the stain, investigators believed it likely came from the perpetrator during a violent encounter. This was the first major piece of physical evidence in the case. However, there was a catch. When the forensic team tried to analyze the DNA for identification, they ran into limitations. They couldn't extract a full DNA profile, and thus weren't able to use the CODIS database to search for matches. Instead of being discouraged, Young took a more manual approach. His first thought was to re-examine the prime suspect from decades earlier. By 2017, McCoy was deceased, but Detective Young located some of McCoy's surviving relatives and asked for DNA cheek swabs. If McCoy had been the perp, his family members would share some genetic markers with the DNA from the crime scene. McCoy's family members were eager to prove his innocence, and the results were conclusive. There was no match whatsoever. The unknown DNA didn't appear to come from McCoy, effectively ruling out the man who had once been the prime suspect. By the early 2020s, investigative genetic genealogy had emerged as a powerful tool for solving cold cases. Detective Young decided it was time to try what was then still an unconventional approach on Annette's case. This genealogical research led Detective Young to several individuals who turned out to be relatives of the person who left DNA on Annette's coat. Using those genetic leads, Young built out family trees and zeroed in on a particular family name that kept appearing: Sims. This was a familiar name from the original case file. In fact, Wilkie Sims, Annette's ex-boyfriend, had been mentioned in the 1974 investigation notes. Detective Young now had a strong circumstantial case pointing to Sims. However, solid proof was needed to conclusively tie the DNA to him. There was an immediate complication. Sims couldn't be interrogated or asked for a DNA sample because he had died in 2015. But even death wouldn't let him escape scrutiny. Young found that Sims had children, and one of them could potentially provide the key to confirm his guilt. In 2023, armed with a court order, the detective obtained a DNA sample from one of Walton Sims's sons. Young sent the two samples, one from the crime scene and one from the relative, to a laboratory for analysis. The waiting period was tense, but the results were definitive. Wilkie Sims had left the genetic material there. Beaver County authorities publicly named Walton Sims, the former boyfriend who had long been in the case file's shadows, as the perpetrator. Okay, so if you're a regular viewer of any of my channels, I suspect you may already have guessed that I was going to add some additional commentary at the end of this segment. Personally, I have a lot of problems accepting that Wilkie Sims did it, and I suspect this wouldn't have been said officially if the man was still alive at the time. Although investigators linked the Coat DNA to the Sims family, Wilkie Sims was a documented ex-boyfriend of Annette's, and everyone accepts this to be fact. This offers a straightforward and potentially innocent explanation for his genetic material to appear on her clothing. Normal consensual contact could easily explain how this sort of biological material ended up on the coat. Further, there's no evidence to indicate that this biological material actually came from the night of the attack. Wilkie Sims claimed that he was in West Virginia at the time, and if the biological evidence was found fresh with evidence of an indecent assault, this would be entirely different. In that case, I think the evidence would be sufficient to say that he was likely the responsible party, but that's not the evidence as it's presented to us. Crucially, there's nothing whatsoever in the way of independent corroboration to make this theory work. For example, there's no reliable eyewitness placing Sims with Annette that night. Further yet, there are no other forensic links tying him to the scene whatsoever. Given those gaps, a jury could reasonably accept innocent explanations for the DNA and conclude the evidence doesn't eliminate reasonable doubt. However, here, of course, there never will be a jury, and the evidence will never be subjected to the rigors of a trial. Based on the evidence alone, I just simply don't see that there's enough here to stop investigating this case. It's very possible that the true monster that attacked Annette that night can now rest easily, knowing the case is fully closed. Anyway, this isn't the first time I've seen this sort of weak logic applied to cold cases where the supposed perpetrator is already deceased. It offers a convenient excuse to close out a cold case while placing the blame on someone who can no longer say anything to counteract what the authorities say. It may give some comfort to the families involved, but upon closer examination, in a case like this, it shouldn't, since there would have never been enough evidence to convict Sims.